often what we know as fungi look like this, right? You might put them on your pizza, or you hate them, you think they're slimy slugs. People love or hate mushrooms, but there's so much more to the fungi than what we really know about, and just kind of general everyday ideas about them. Fungi are really important in being decomposers. So I know we talked about the D&Ds. Does somebody have a page number?
147.
147, everybody. So you should get caught up on your own up to that page. So the classification and the plants and the fungi, or the plants and classification and plants. Fungi are a very important decomposer group. So some of them you can see, some of the decomposers you can see like this, and some of them are not as apparent in the fall. So as the leaves are changing colors and they fall off the trees, when the trees go dormant over the winter time because temperatures go lower and the availability of water is far less and less sunlight, the leaves fall off, they go on the ground. We do still have some leaves in the spring, but one of the things is that we don't have huge piles of leaves everywhere is due to the fungus and the bacteria, the decomposers. So just remember, they're doing all this magical work all year long, breaking down the dead things and the waste of things. And without them, we'd be in big trouble in the world. The big job of doing this breaking down is to make sure that nutrients are put back into the ground for the autotrophs so that the producers can have those nutrients to rebuild in the spring when the conditions get better. So that's why the trees are able to put leaves back on and plants are able to grow, algae are able to repopulate largely in the summertime. So if we look, and you guys will look today under the microscope, and when you look under the microscope, what you're going to see is that while, as I said, a lot of them are doing all this kind of magical work on their own, we don't see much of them. When you look under the microscope, and even if you looked under the microscope at a mushroom, we'll talk about other ones, you would see this configuration. It's kind of like clothing that you see this mass, right? Like I have this sweatshirt on, and you can see it, and if we looked under the microscope, you would start to see individual threads with, even though it doesn't look like it, but there are little pores or spaces between the threads here. So it's kind of like this is the mass or the body of the fungi, and you look under the microscope and you see individual threads. And so we have names, we have specific terms for this. And the filamentous bodies, meaning like the clothing, is the mycelium. The individual threads are called the hyphae or hyphae, depending on where you come from and who teaches you. So all of these thread-like filaments are the hyphae, and the whole mass is the mycelium. The body is the mycelium. You also see these, it almost looks like viruses, but these are fruiting bodies, the way that they reproduce. So we do see their reproductive mechanisms as well, which are extensions from the hyphae, and then they have this fruiting body, and then there's dots all over them, and those are the spores. Spores, does anybody have seasonal allergies? Yeah, so a lot of you guys are allergic to what they're doing. They're trying to reproduce so that they can do more decomposition. I know I have the fungal allergy. This time of year, it's pretty high as the leaves are starting to fall and they're reproducing a lot. So you might notice lately, which I know in times of COVID, freak you out a little bit. When your nose starts to run a little bit, you might run a really low-grade fever. You feel sluggish. All those things might be combined together. And that's probably due to your seasonal fungal allergy. So again, if we take a look at the three kind of parts of it, you've got the mass, the mycelium. if you look at the mycelium under the microscope, you can see the hyphae, the individual strings or threads of the body. And here's kind of an interesting blow up of even the mycelium to show some of the parts of the fungus. That fungus do have a cell wall, or fungi have a cell wall, and then they have these pores, and from those pores they release enzymes and other substances that help them to decompose, but they do the decomposition outside of their body. So digestion happens outside their body. They kind of spread those things onto whatever they're trying to break down, and then as the chemicals go to work and breaking down, they suck in what is broken down. So it'd essentially be like if you had a piece of pizza in front of you, and you were like, bleh, and you threw up all of your stomach acids and your enzymes onto there, and then you waited a while, and then you just went like this and absorbed it through your skin, what was broken down. So a lot different mechanism. Sounds kind of gross, right? That's the way they do it. All right, so again, mode of nutrition, enzymes, other substances, other chemicals get secreted. You can see more obviously this log that's fallen has a lot of mushrooms on there. There's lots of other fungi and bacteria on here as well doing work. If you remember from your lab on Tuesday, this is a plant called moss. And then what they're doing again, thankfully, they're eating dead things and the waste. So all of those dead things and waste don't pile up around the world. Every organism has its place in the world. However, fungi are not just decomposers. There's other groups of fungi that will be parasitic, and some are symbiotic, and we'll take a look at those in the different groupings as well. They do all kinds of, the fungi do all kinds of cool stuff. So as I mentioned, if you have seasonal allergies to mold, it's because they spew their spores out into the air, and you can't see them, right? So they're floating around. This is all blown up. These are microscopic. So imagine these are just invisible and they're floating around. There's a lot of different kinds of fungi in the world. Some of them are worse than others. If you have black mold growing in the walls in your house due to a water leak, you have to get that taken care of because it can be deadly in large quantities. But sometimes you just have mold and it's gross and it smells bad. But it's just the differentiation of that is very important, especially when you have a home. These are the fruiting bodies. So what you can physically see, or the larger parts, all that mycelium grouped together are the fruiting bodies. So we're going to take a look at in lab a lot of different kinds of fungi. This is a cup fungus, which makes sense, right? It looks like a little cup. These are morels. These are very, very expensive food type mushrooms. Some people go hunting for them in the forest at certain times of the year. In the fall, they might be going looking for them right now as they're starting to grow from all the moisture and dead things growing. And a lot of people make good livings off of collecting these. So let's take a look at this question. So if a really strong fungicide is released and eliminates all the fungi in an ecosystem, which of the following is likely to happen? So give yourself a second to read it over. And then a lot of you guys are saying C, right, good. So C is correct. So we need them, right? We're gonna have an accumulation of dead things, the waste of things in our ecosystems. In addition, this directly, it's not only just going to be waste and dead things are going to accumulate, but we're going to start to lose our producers in our ecosystem because, well, it depends on the bacterial colonies in the ecosystem, but likely because the fungi do a big job of decomposition, you're not going to get enough nutrients recycled by the fungi, and so your plant or your producers, could be algae also, are going to suffer, and then you won't have food for the trophic levels in the ecosystem. Soil fertility is going to go down, not improve. This is going to go down, this is going to decrease, and this is going to decrease. So all of these are the opposite, and this one is true. So let's talk about our first example of a fungi in a symbiotic relationship with an algae or another producer. Could be algae, these could be algae, or they could be a photosynthetic bacteria, sometimes called cyanobacteria. This is called lichen. The CH is like a K sound, lichen. Lichen, so you know. So again, the lichen is in a symbiotic relationship. The clear parts are the fungi, and the green are either a photosynthetic bacteria or algae that they house inside of their body. So the nice thing is that as this heterotroph, the fungus is a heterotroph, as they give off carbon dioxide, the photosynthetic algae or bacteria, the autotroph, is going to take that carbon dioxide, it's going to turn it into oxygen, which is going to be given back to not only itself, but also the fungus. And then as the fungus gives off water as well, can share the water, the carbon dioxide in addition is going to allow the producers to make sugar or make food for the fungus. And so their products of cellular respiration are going to help to feed them and sustain them, but also themselves. And the products of photosynthesis are going to feed and sustain them. So they have a nice symbiotic relationship between the two. Here's another example of a lichen. This is under the microscope, and this is what they look like. Sometimes you'll see them on rocks, sometimes you'll see them on trees and logs. Once you're walking around in the world, you'll start seeing them more now that you know what they are, but they're usually whitish, and they have kind of a green center to them, or green inside of them. So it'd be really nice if you were some kind of photosynthetic bacteria or algae, and you got a really safe home, you're protected. You got a regular supply of water and carbon dioxide. Nice warm home, protected from harsh conditions from the world. And then in return, in this symbiotic relationship, you can provide back food, oxygen to your warm, nice, safe shelter of the fungus. This really reduces what the fungus has to do. Fungus can reduce its needs down to 10% of what it has to go out and collect in terms of food. The algae can provide about 90% of its energy needs. So that would be great, right? If you had this living inside of you, some kind of photosynthetic bacteria or algae that could just give you 90% of what you need and make you able to be more efficient in your everyday needs. You'd consistently have energy and oxygen, and in terms of money-wise, you'd save a lot. This is called Mycorrhizae. So Mycorrhizae. Also a symbiotic relationship, but this is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a plant. Again, Mycorrhizae. Usually it's in sandy soil, and what the fungus does is the fungus helps to attract water in very dry, sandy soil, and it gives it over to the plants. A lot of plants who just in general have this, we do see this symbiotic relationship, but more specifically, or probably more importantly, you see it in like desert plants, where it's a lot drier, and so that fungus can help the plants to have a lot more water. And then also provide other great things, like it can leach glucose and other nutrients to the plant as well. So they have a really great relationship here. So water, minerals, things to help the plant grow, really important water. fungus gets something in return though, they also get, from the plant, they get sugars back. And so that can help to feed them. So they help each other again, a nice symbiotic relationship called Mycorrhizae. So let's see who did their homework and went over lecture. Which tube transports sugars down to the roots of a plant? What do you guys think? B is the water, xylem. The X is a Z sound. Xylem takes water from the roots upward. The phloem takes the sugars and transports them down. So the correct answer is C, phloem. Phloem, sugars down, xylem, water up. This is penicillium. Penicillium is one of the things that it produces is the antibiotic penicillin. This is the first antibiotic that was discovered. It was discovered by accident. This mold was growing on a bacterial plate. And the scientists went, I'm going to check this out, and found out that it could make something that killed the bacteria, because when you notice where the mold was, there was no bacteria growing around it. And went, there's got to be some correlation here between this mold and the bacteria. And that's how this first antibiotic was discovered, and the idea of antibiotics, that something could kill off bacteria. Now, you don't want to process this yourself because you probably have had penicillium in your house, like on citrus, when this happens to citrus. I'm sure sometimes you bought a bag of oranges and you come home and you find one of these in there. So a good thing is take that one out of the bag, wipe all the rest of them down, and the rest of them are fine. But you wouldn't want to just treat yourself like, oh, I'm sick, I'm going to eat that. No, it's processed in an important way and then dosed appropriately. A lot of your blue cheeses have penicillium that makes them have that unique moldy taste. I know, you love or you hate it, right? A lot of these things. We're going to take a look at yeast underneath the microscope today. Another fungi. Produces some of my favorite things. Bread, of course, bread. Does it through the process of fermentation. So I went down to lab this morning and I put some warm water with some yeast and some sugar in there, and I covered it up, and I made a anaerobic environment. No oxygen. I tried to take as much oxygen out, and so right now they're fermenting. And what the yeast are doing is that these individual little yeasts here are starting to give off carbon dioxide, part of respiration, but they're giving off more carbon dioxide with this process because I'm keeping it all contained in there. If we had a really, really, really strong microscope, we would see this is the main body of the yeast, and they grow what are called buds. This is one of the ways that they asexually reproduce, which means that they're producing a genetically exact copy or almost exact. Could be some mutations that happen by accident, but mostly exactly like them. And then just start budding off a new individual off the side of them. We don't do that because we're way more complex than they are, but imagine that you're sitting in class and your bud starts growing a head off the side of your body, and then all day your bud keeps growing and you gotta carry bud around. This would be really difficult. When organisms have gravity, they don't bud because it would be too hard to carry your bud around. In water, hanging out in water, my bud can grow, and because there's no gravity, my bud can grow and then fall off, and I'm like, woo, I made a bud. What we're going to be looking at is this under the microscope, and so there's 3 things to look at here. One is the individual circles, the perfect circles in here. Those are the fungal bodies of the yeast. So those are their fruiting bodies. When you see a little tiny circle coming off, like this one right here, right there, when they don't look so perfect, they have something coming off of them, they're growing the bud. So what are these? These are carbon dioxide bubbles. So these are gas bubbles. Anytime under the microscope, when you see a really dark circle, a perfect circle, and it's really dark, that's some kind of gas. So a lot of times students are like, oh, I see it. I'm like, no, that's gas, okay? So that's gases that are being formed by the yeast bodies, and the little bud coming off of them. This is Palabolos. Palabolos are called cap-throwing fungus. You can see these sometimes if you go in the forest and you look at logs. You might see these. They're usually about that big, they're really little. And you'll see these dark caps that they have. They start to put their spores into a little hat on top of them. Do you think they're gonna throw their caps? They're gonna explode their caps off their body. And so it's a really good mechanism of passing on the next generation, because what happens is they collect water in their bodies, and they collect more and more water, and because they have a cell wall, they can't really expand so much. And so eventually this has a thinner surface area than their body does, and they have accumulation of spores in here that eventually they collect so much water that this is going to get so much pressure, and then poosh, and poof, they come up. They throw their cap with their spores inside of them. Many of these cap-throwing fungus, the Palabolos, like to grow on feces of deer and elk. And so you can't see them on trees, for example, but you also will see them on poop. Part of their life cycle is to actually get inside of animals, the ones that are more animal specific. And so they have to go through the digestive system. The strategy of a lot of plants is the same. That seeds, like the walls of fungi, are very tough. And so like, if you read lecture the other day, the seeds have to go through a digestive system of an animal. So that's why fruit are around, because fruit are yummy, right? So animals don't eat fruit like we do, right? We eat the fruit and we throw the seeds out. So next time you do that, realize you're throwing out an organism that has the potential to become the fruit itself. So don't feel bad, you're just throwing out a baby. But you're also eating the ovary of that plant. So you're biting into a nice, juicy ovary. Weird, plants are weird. So what the animals do is, because they're not like eating it and just throwing that away, let's say a peach, for example, that has that pit inside, the animal, the other animals besides us, will be like, and probably swallow the pit. And the pit is really hard, and so the digestion process starts to break down the walls of that pit, so that when they poop with all those nutrients that they ate that are left over in the poop, it leaves a really nice environment. Imagine you leave your baby in a pile of poop to grow. That's weird. But it's a good environment, because while poop is gross, it actually is really important because it has lots of nutrients to help that seed to sprout and grow.
Is it like how they say a lot of mushrooms and stuff growing like cow manure, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's delicious to them. So anyway, back to the fungi. Fungi are similar to plants in that they're going to get on poop and there's nutrients, and then they can grow. And so some of the species of cap-throwing fungus get on the poop, but they want to get into the digestive system of the animal that pooped them out. But do you think that animal's going to eat its own poop? No. So their little heads, dung is also called poop or feces, lots of different names we have for it. You probably have some more crude names for it too. My 10-year-old loves to say them all. So what they do is on the poop, they actually start to bend that head, that bulbous part with the hat on it, they start to bend it in the direction of sunlight. So they have an attraction to sunlight, so at least bend in that direction. So if they're in the forest, for example, and they know that they don't know this because they don't have a brain, but they are just trained to turn toward the sunlight where there might be grass and other plants that the elk or the deer would eat. And so they turn toward the direction of sun. This behavior hopefully will then shoot their spores onto plants that the animal would eat rather than their own poop. And that's the way that they can potentially get into the digestive tract, go through that digestive process in the deer or the elk or the animal that will eat them. But they don't have a brain, right? This is a behavior that's instinctual in this organism. So it's kind of amazing that some of these organisms that we don't really know are out there and do really important things have these interesting behaviors that are not programmed by a brain or a nervous system, but they are genetically programmed too. So water pressure builds up. These teeny little, we're talking about, they're millimeters in size to maybe like a centimeter or two. They can explode their spores 10, 12, 15 feet away. So if I'm something that's like this big, I can shoot my spores all the way to the door. That's impressive, right? Yeah, so pretty good strategy. So when they are leaning toward the sunlight, they're gonna look like this. You can see that their heads are all pointing in the same direction, in the direction of the sunlight. So they're ready to explode their caps in that direction. This one's a little late to the party. And so very simply, they're trying to aim like that. I guess they don't aim, it just happens. Some fungus are parasites. I'm going to come back to this at the end. I'll show you a video of it because it's really cool. So insects are one of the most, or if not the largest animal group on the planet. And, insects might be annoying to us, but they're really important food, and they do a lot of really important services for their ecosystems. One of the ways that the insects are kept in check is through fungus. And what fungus do is insects are going out and about in their life and they're eating. They sometimes eat spores of fungus. And then from the inside out, those spores grow into mycelium, and the mycelium start to take over their body while they're alive, and then grow, once they've kind of colonized the entire body, they just start sprouting out of the bodies of insects. I like post-apocalyptic fiction, and one series that I read was about fungi that killed off humans in this manner, that their spores, when you breathe them in, they started to do this to humans. But we only know that as insects right now. So maybe a good nightmare for you in the next few days. Another group of parasites are called the Arthrobotters. Arthrobotters. The Arthrobotters, so these are kind of interesting, that I wouldn't feel so bad for them. These right here, these are parasitic worms. So we have a parasite that traps a parasite. Nematodes are the cause of a lot of different diseases, especially in countries where water filtration is poor. We don't worry about it here, thankfully, we're very lucky. So what the Arthrobotters do is they have certain hyphae that grow in rings. And when the hyphae feel something go through them, they puff up and they capture the nematode. So that's one of many methods. There's a lot of different species of Arthrobotters. This is one of the mechanisms that they use. And so then they can start to get inside of the nematode and digest it from the inside out. Here's another species of Arthrobotters. You can see that the mycelium starts to form rings. And so this would be pretty easy for a nematode to swim through. And I'll show you another species. It's another species. Sometimes what they do in some species of Arthrobotters is they have harpoon-like spores. So imagine a spore, you know, we're looking under the microscope and I'm making this bigger. And a lot of the spores are in little circles, but it has a harpoon on the end of it. And so that when it shoots it and it hits the body, it stabs it, and then if the nematode moves around, it can't get out because it's got these backward facing little spikes on it and it's stuck in there. So they have little weapons pew, 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 that they can shoot. It's pretty interesting too. So lots and lots of different species of Arthrobotters. It's another way that the nematodes are kept in check, like the insects were kept in check too. And here's another species of Arthrobotters. So lots of different ones for different species of nematodes. Which of the following is a job that is not performed by any fungi? So pick the one that the fungi do not do. Which one?
C.
Yeah, D, they're not producers. They can house a producer, but they themselves are not producers. So when we're talking about the lichens, they do have them inside of their body, but they themselves are not a producer. Okay. These are chytrids. Chytrids. The CH is a K sound. Chytrids. Well, I should say the CHY, like a K. Chytrids. If you've ever read about frog die-offs that have been significant around the world, you would have been reading about chytrids, likely. Chytrids have been around for a really, really long time. They're mostly freshwater. There's a few marine species, but if you remember a little bit about when we talked about amphibians, which are a frog, that they breathe through their skin. So they do take in gases through their skin, and when they're in water, they might also take in some chytrids, some spores of chytrids, and these have caused a lot of them to die off. These are parasitic type fungi to the frogs, and again, some chytrid species specific to frogs. So those are fungi. So there are a lot of different kinds and kinds of fungi in the world. What do you guys have next?
Diversity of Protists.
Okay, so let's talk about Protistas. Protistas. This used to be, the Protists used to be one kingdom. There's a lot more kingdoms now. There's about 7 kingdoms and a couple more groups that they're sorting out. So there's a lot of changes that are going on. And their reasoning behind now kingdoms of Protista are that there's a lot of diversity. We'll see where they settle up into. Most of them are unicellular. Some of them are colonial, meaning that they're unicellular, but they live in a group and work like a multicellular organism, but are still individuals living in a group or a colony. Kind of an interesting concept there for survival. And then some are multicellular, meaning that they're bigger in size and a lot more complex. So just based on the sizes of cells, some of them are individual cells, some of them are individual cells grouped in a group that kind of act like a bigger organism but aren't, and then some of them are a bigger, more complex organism. And so they used to just say, oh, the protists are one kingdom, and then they started to go, but there's a lot of diversity in how they live and their strategies of just cellular-wise survival. Some of them are autotrophs, and some of them are heterotrophs. So again, that's a big diversity there. And some of them only produce asexually, and some of them do both asexual and sexual reproduction. So again, so much diversity that when people started looking at, scientists started looking at the protists in kind of the more modern age and looking at biochemistry, they started to go, let's start to separate these more. So there's some examples. Some of them are under the microscope. You would see this as like a little green thing like a green triangle, square, diamond, I should say, diamond shape, with a tail. You could see that kind of moving around, really small. And some of them are a little bit bigger. You can see this one, for example, has chloroplast structures inside of them. So let's first talk about the plant-like protists. One big important group are called the diatoms. Diatoms are also called phytoplankton. So phyto related to the sun, like photosynthesis. The term plankton, just so you know, is a term where organisms are in water, and when a current comes, they have no control of where they go. They can't fight that current. So these are just kind of floating around, moving with the currents in water. Most of them we're looking at are marine or saltwater related. Some jellyfish, some bigger organisms can be part of the plankton group, like big jellyfish, because they just have the ability to kind of squish their bell for movement. If a current comes, they just float with the current. So, but most of them are really small, microscopic. These are also in the algae group or seaweed group. A lot of them have these encasements of silica, which silica was an early way to make glass. So they have almost like glass-like coverings on them. And the diatoms are super cool in terms of their shapes and their patterns and their sizes. And you can see just such a variety of what they look like under the microscope. Really neat. They are, again, remember, they're producers or they're photosynthetic, and you can see individual cells, but they are one cell. So here's a conundrum for them, is that if they're single cell and they're photosynthetic and they live mostly in the marine world or the oceans, saltwater, and the oceans are warming because of climate change at accelerated rates, that they're going to be very sensitive to that warming. Do you think you have any reliance on these? When you say no, and I say yes, mine always is a trick question, right? So we absolutely have a reliance on these little single-celled organisms that live all the way out in the ocean, far away, because they produce about 80%, 70 to 70% of the oxygen on the earth through their photosynthetic activity. So yeah, I think we have a need for them, right? They are the basis of a lot of food and oxygen for the food web or the trophic levels in the oceans. So we might have a little bit of relationship, right, if you eat some of the ocean creatures, but definitely if they're making that much oxygen for the earth, we're going to use some of that. And if they start to decline, then our oxygen availability starts to decline. The other thing to think about in terms of them, if the oceans in warming, as temperatures get warmer, warmth affects cells in little quantities in good ways because it can speed up metabolic activity, but if it gets too warm, it can start to do things like denature proteins, and that would slow down everything because proteins do a lot of the most important things that we need in our cells. So think about like our bodies, for example, is that we really exist in a certain range of temperature. We're very sensitive to temperature as an organism. That our body temperature is about 98 degrees. If our body temperature gets up into the 104s, you start to get a little cuckoo, right? Anybody ever have a temperature of like 103.5 or above? You get a little crazy, right? Yeah, it's bad. Bad things start to happen. I've had a number of them. And if you get into the 104s, 105s, 106, 107, 108, usually you've kind of like fried most of the important things in your body. Your brain starts to literally cook, and then you're dead. So you've got about 10 degrees. You only got about 10 degrees of leeway. So think about that the next time they say that in the next decade, the Earth is going to warm 2.5 degrees. Carbon dioxide is a sink into the ocean, gets absorbed by the ocean, and more carbon dioxide means higher temperatures, which means the ocean temperatures start to rise. In addition, carbon dioxide as a sink into the ocean, it interacts with other chemicals in the ocean and it becomes acidic. And so now you've got these little single-celled things dealing with warmer temperatures and higher acidity, and so they've got this double whammy of things to deal with. And so when you think like, well, whatever, the temperature's warming, not a big deal, it's not gonna affect me that much, it's gonna catch up to us. And so do what you can now to try and influence what you can do to get mostly governments who are influenced by corporations who do bad things to stop doing what they're doing and move to solutions rather than band-aids. And you, especially if you're going to have children or you have children, they're gonna suffer immensely. We probably will get away with it somewhat. I mean, things are getting uncomfortable, right? So things are getting a little uncomfortable that we can do like a Band-Aid and go inside in the winter, in the summertime when it's cold, when it's hot. When it gets really hot, you can go in and turn your air conditioning on, but a lot of people are dying around the world. And even in our own country, we live in more of an insulated area of the world to a lot of the climate change factors. So you live in a nice place, has fresh water availability, our temperatures don't swing so badly that we're in danger of dying yet. But go outside of your own backyard, meaning go into other parts of even the United States, and bad things are happening. Okay, so let's go about other algae, now that I've given you a bunch of nightmares for tonight. Other algae, you can see them unlike the diatoms, and they are producers and the basis of ecosystems. So like this is brown algae, for example. You'll find it in more cold temperature ocean water. It's called giant kelp. It can grow hundreds of feet tall. It kind of looks like a forest, right? You can walk out in the forest and it looks like a forest. And like what trees as producers do for the forest, they do for the marine environment in colder areas. And so they produce, of course, food, but then they also produce places for living, hiding, growing your eggs, nurturing your offspring, hiding from predators, trying to hide and get prey. And so they do all those things that just like a forest would do. This is red algae. Red algae is very common on places like warmer temperature climates of coral reefs in the ocean. It absorbs calcium inside of its body. So this is a really good source of calcium for a lot of people around the world. We might see this becoming more and more and more popular as maybe cows start to phase out as milk. And regardless, if we think about drinking milk as your calcium source, it's kind of gross in that, so milk, like cow milk, let's think about what milk is supposed to do for an organism. What does milk feed, or who does milk feed? Babies. Are you a baby cow? Yeah, oh, yeah. Patrick's a baby cow, okay. Good costume. But you're drinking the milk of another organism that's supposed to feed their babies. That's weird. Weird. All right, so we're going to see more and more other kinds of milks available to us as people start to figure out, one, cows are one of the leading groups of climate change gas destructors by their methane. So plus, eating their meat too is kind of goes along with that. So a lot of groups are starting to think about maybe we can lessen our reliance on meat. I'm a mostly vegetarian, but I gotta say I love cow milk yogurt. I'm trying to embrace other kinds of like nut milk yogurts, or oat is a real good one, and hemp is a really good one, because oat and hemp, as opposed to nuts, they grow really fast and they're really cheap. And so I'm trying to embrace those two. I'm working at it. I love cheese too. Oh, I love cheese. So I'm trying again to embrace other kinds of milk cheeses, because I know it's better. So even though I'm a vegetarian, I'm not necessarily best for the environment either, so I can admit that. But I'm trying. Maybe we'll get some like red algae cheese that'll be delicious. I hope. All right, so do you think you had some red algae today? You did. I hope you did. I hope you brushed your teeth. I know, my little questions. If you look at ingredients for things that are kind of gooey substances, is you will often see carrageenan as a component, which is a red algae. And so in things like ice cream, whipped cream, chocolate milk usually has like a thicker component to it. Usually has carrageenan. Toothpaste, a lot of toothpaste have carrageenan in it. I know, my trick question. So we do rely on it. Agar, like we use in lab. A lot of lotions and face products, cosmetics have carrageenan in there to make them kind of goopy. So we do have a great reliance on them. And then if we're looking more specifically at the non-ocean environment, non-marine, not salt, in freshwater environments like our pond out there, probably what you're more familiar with in our area, or the Great Lakes, is that you have the green algae. And again, they're the kind of basis producer autotrophs for our ecosystems of water around here, our freshwater ecosystems. And the evolutionary kind of branching of remember that everything grew in water before it went to land? Is they believed plants had adaptations that allowed them, as they got closer to shore, they had mutations or adaptations that allowed some of them to survive on land and colonize land. And so when they biochemically look, they know that plants are most closely related to green algae or freshwater algae, which might make a little bit of sense. Green algae are being looked at as a solution for better fuel for cars. Biofuel. So they can grow algae. There's these green algae farms that can be turned into fuel or biodiesel. A lot of people are studying this because, as opposed to fossil fuels, which are dead things, we only have so many past dead things that can make oil for cars, for example, to make gasoline. So we're going to run out sometime. So we really need to think about better solutions for our cars. I know we're looking at a lot of plug-ins for electricity, but again, electricity comes from somewhere, fossil fuels mostly. So here's another thing, it's like, well, we gotta go this way, or we gotta go the electricity way, and the electricity way is gonna be wind and water turbines, wind, water, solar, thank you. That will hopefully, and that's in a lot of, if you read the stimulus packages going on now, there's a lot of push to start giving subsidies toward renewables. Governmentally, there's a lot of influence by coal, oil, gas, to keep the government giving them subsidies or money to keep going. And there's a lot of people that say, we should really be shifting in this direction. So this is one of the directions that's in there. And these guys can produce, so one is it makes the reliance on making fuel from living things rather than fossil things, non-living things that are gonna run out, right? So here's a shift that's really good, because we can grow these over and over and over again. These guys can double their body weight in like a day. Imagine you could double your body weight in a day. That would be impressive, right? Yeah, that's pretty impressive. And so they can do it, double their body weight, double. And every time you make a double, remember, it's exponentially growing your population, and that's really good. So that's good. But what's bad about it is that you still need like warm housing for this, right? So you still need a building with sun. It depends on, like, this one is clearly outside. It looks like giant test tubes. So this one can be done in a cold environment, I mean a warm environment. This one could be done in a cold environment, but then you need to house it and keep it warm enough so that it does that growing the way it needs to be warm. And so like in this environment, for example, if you have to warm them, where is your fuel coming from to warm your factory? Electricity. And electricity is coming from fossil fuels. So you're using fossil fuels to grow non-fossil fuel. Right? And so what we found is that it takes more energy to house them than they actually do produce in fuel. So there's a deficit there. And so people are like, see, there's a deficit, forget it, not a good idea. But is it still producing fuel that lowers our need for fossil fuel? So there's that, like, so you guys figure out how to make this more efficient. Okay, one of you, please. You're so smart. That's your job. There's so many cool things for you to figure out. So do it. The whole biofield, whole biological field. So if you just thought, I'm going to be a doctor or a pharmacist, there's other things you can do that are really cool. I can make you a lot of money. All right, last one I'm going to talk about are not so good algae, or producers of the protists, which are called, well, this one is the red tide. This particular dinoflagellate species we hear about when waters get too warm in the ocean. Like down in the Gulf of Mexico, we hear about this every so often, that there's these toxic tides or red tides, and it kills off a lot of shellfish that people eat, so clams and oysters and shrimp and lobsters, things that we like to eat. We'll kill them off. We can't go in there because it's toxic. It usually causes for humans, because you're not going to eat it, but it'll cause rashes, really bad rashes on your body. So it'll keep people out of and going to the coastal regions. And so it does kind of a double whammy to the community of people, is that any of the people who are fisher people that are going to grow or rely on collecting mollusks and clams and shrimp and lobster, they don't have any income because it's killing off the animals that they're collecting for us to eat. So their livelihoods go down. But then also people don't want to visit these areas because they're like, well, I want to go somewhere I can swim in the ocean. Well, I can't swim there. I'm not going to go to that town. And so anybody who relies on tourism, they're going to lose too. So not good. They're good dinoflagellates, however, and they help corals to survive. These are called zooxanthellae. So interesting, right, that there's a zoo, or zoo, you could say zooxanthellae if you want. I've always been taught zooxanthellae. So the X is a Z sound again, zooxanthellae. And they live underneath the skin of corals, and they are a producer. So it's kind of like the lichen activity, right? If you've got a photosynthetic organism that lives underneath your skin, then it's going to help you reduce your energy needs, and you can do more things like reproduce and colonize coral reefs. But here's another one of those warming issues. They don't like it so warm. And so when the oceans get warm in coral reef areas, tropical areas, they leave their coral. And then imagine if something were giving you 90% of all of your energy needs, and then they were like, hey, yeah, see ya. So like if your parents kicked you out and you're like, good luck. It's like that. The corals are like, shoot, now we gotta do 100% as opposed to 10%. And they don't do a good job in surviving. So here's another conundrum that we have. All right, let's go to a second group, the animal-like protists. These act like animals. Protozoa, you're probably familiar with. I'm sure you looked under the microscope in middle school, and you saw these little things swimming around. Those are protozoa. They're heterotrophic. They have to get their own food, so they are predators. They'll eat algae and they'll eat other unicellular organisms. They are not photosynthetic. Here's some examples of some of them. Paramecium, these guys with the tail, and they go around. Like I talked about the phytoplankton, there are zooplankton. So in the marine layer, you got your phytoplankton, and you have this whole trophic system. The phytos get eaten by the zoos, and they're called zooplankton because they kind of are like animals. Some of them are animals, and some of them are like animals. Amoebas are another one. You get that Snapchat every so often that says, an amoeba ate somebody's brain. Don't drink water anymore. The amoeba will eat your brain. That's usually a really big fluke that happens. So, amoebas are blobby type protists. They're both predators and they can be parasites. So, right, like when you see that notification about someone's brain got eaten by an amoeba. It's a rare parasite. They can cause, like if you go to a foreign country, like let's say you go to Mexico and you get that stomach sickness, it might be caused by an amoeba. Occasionally brain nerves, but they're predators, and so what they do, they're super cool. They are these like blobs, and then they have these arms that they can grow out of their blobs, and then they can encompass something. Like, come here, hug me, ha ha ha, I ate you. So they're tricky. The movie, if you want to see another, it's great that it's Halloween time almost. A scary movie, one of the kind of old, early scary movies was called The Blob, and the person got the idea from amoebas. I always like to think about the protists, especially these animal-like protists. If they were walking down the halls of the world, we'd be so terrified. So terrified, because they're really, really just insane, but they're microscopic. So we're like, oh, you're so cute and microscopic. But if they were our size, whoa. So if you have aspirations to make a side movie, this is amoebas don't look like much, right? Like you could see that it's eaten something that has chloroplasts in it. It doesn't have them itself, but it ate something. Another parasitic / animal-like organism are called Plasmodium. They cause malaria. Malaria are carried by mosquitoes, but not in our side of the world, thankfully. I think I just read yesterday that they're trying out a vaccine for malaria. Anybody else read that? Was it malaria?
Malaria would be in Africa, right?
Yeah, big in Africa and a lot of other countries that don't have a lot of filtration in their water, more tropical and warmer, more mosquito seasons. You know why there's so many mosquitoes? Remember we talked about this in evolution? Because the warm season is longer, so mosquitoes have 2 life cycles as opposed to usually having 1. So a lot of bugs you see them around a lot now, still. But these ones, the mosquito, let's see, I do have an illustration. The mosquito will carry the Plasmodium on their stinger, and when they sting you, it injects them almost, like it provides an injection site for the Plasmodium to get in your body. And then the parasites, these ones specifically grow in the liver, and they multiply in your red blood cells as your blood goes through the liver. And then it brings sickness all over your body. Malaria, one of the early dangers is losing your fingers and your toes, where your circulation is smaller, is they'll block that up. So that's where you have to be, not only fever is a big thing, but it's losing your digits, fingers and toes are an early danger of malaria. So now we're going to get to the last group of the protists, which are the fungal life protists, because they look like mycelium and hyphae and fruiting bodies. So when people first saw these, before we had DNA technology to tell the difference, they were like, oh, that's totally right. That looks like what we just talked about, a fungus. It's not though. It's genetically different. These are called slime molds. And just super anatomically similar to fungi. And so here, just think about like the diversity of what we saw. For example, if we're looking at like the diatoms, do these look anything like a diatom? They look nothing like a diatom, right? So do these look anything like an amoeba? No. There's so much diversity in the protists that grouping them in one group was kind of funny to think about it, and now that they're separating them out, makes so much more sense. So if you like puzzles, oh man, genetics is a great place to go because we're sorting so much out. And think about, well, we haven't gotten into too much detail, but if you remember from the lectures the other day, that the bacteria and the archaea, they don't have any kingdoms yet. They're the most abundant biomass on the earth of the bacteria and the archaea. So there's so many puzzles to start figuring out groupings of all these organisms. Genetics is cool. So if you go to bioengineering, UIC has an awesome master's program in bioengineering right here in your backyard. Really world class. So planting ideas. Other fungal-like protists are the Great Potato Famine protist. That's where it was made famous back in the history of Ireland, for example, where a lot of potatoes were grown and wiped out all their potatoes and caused a famine in the country. We still to this day see vineyards, like West Coast has a lot of these problems. Avocado stands where they're growing tons and tons of avocados around the world. If they had infections from some kind of fungus, we're talking about these guys.